Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open something truly wild. The story of how America decided that real food was simply too much effort and replaced it with something that came in a can, a box, a foil pouch, and occasionally a colour that does not exist in nature. We're talking about the 1950s processed food boom, the decade when housewives traded their stovetops for can openers, when scientists in lab coats started moonlighting as chefs, and when a loaf of bread somehow managed to stay soft for 3 weeks without a single person asking why. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuinely huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly, you just made several dozen people question every meal they ate in their childhood. Your suggestions are the reason this channel exists, and I mean that. If you want to leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, please do. It's one of my favourite parts of making these videos. Also, the channel is now live on Spotify, so if you want to take tonight's journey on your commute or on a walk, the link is waiting for you in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, maybe pull your blanket up, and let's ease into tonight together. But first, let's just pause for a second. Have you ever stared at the ingredients list on a can of cream of mushroom soup and wondered what half of those words are? Has a food ever been described as cheese-flavoured and you just accepted it? Did your grandmother serve something that came in a jello mould with actual vegetables suspended inside it like insects in amber, and everyone at the table acted like that was completely normal? Could you survive a week eating only what came in cans and boxes from a 1950s kitchen? Would you trust a food that was invented by a corporation, approved by a committee, taste tested by 12 people in a conference room in New Jersey, and then aggressively marketed to your mother as the future of cooking? And here's the really unsettling one. Did any of those foods actually taste good? Or did an entire generation just convince themselves they did because the alternative was admitting they'd been had? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1952 America. There's a television in the living room, a brand new refrigerator humming in the kitchen, and inside that refrigerator is something in a can with a label so cheerful it feels almost threatening. Dinner is 45 minutes away, and it involves absolutely zero fresh ingredients. Welcome to the future. It's beige, it's gelatinous, and it is extremely proud of itself. Let's start at the beginning, the real beginning, before the TV dinners and the powdered cheese and the soup that came in a can the size of a small moon. Before all of that, the American kitchen was a place of actual labour, real labour, the kind where you stood over a stove for 3 hours on a Tuesday not because you wanted to, but because if you didn't, your family simply did not eat. There were no shortcuts, no packets, no flavour pouches. You made the broth from the bones. You grew the vegetables or you bought them that morning from someone who did. Food was fresh, seasonal, regional, and absolutely exhausting to produce. And then the 1940s happened. And then the 1950s happened even harder. In the decades before the processed food boom, the average American household spent somewhere between 4 and 6 hours a day on food preparation. 4 to 6 hours. Not cooking a dinner party, not preparing a feast for the holidays, just Tuesday. Just the regular, unremarkable act of feeding a family. Bread was baked from scratch. Stocks were made from leftover bones and vegetable scraps. Beans were soaked overnight because there was no other way to make them edible. Preserving food for winter meant actually preserving it yourself. Canning, salting, smoking, fermenting, skills that were passed down from mother to daughter like a particularly labour-intensive heirloom. The icebox, and then, slowly, the early refrigerator helped, but only so much. Perishables were bought frequently, often daily, because they didn't keep for long, and because the concept of buying a week's worth of food in one trip required a refrigerator large enough to store it, which most families didn't have yet. The grocery store was a small neighbourhood affair. The butcher was separate from the baker, who was separate from the greengrocer. Shopping for food was itself a task requiring multiple stops, multiple conversations, and a functional relationship with the people who sold you things. This is the part where we pause and acknowledge something uncomfortable. That level of food labour fell almost entirely on women, not by negotiation, not by preference, and certainly not by coincidence. The domestic sphere was women's domain, and the kitchen was its centrepiece. A woman who could cook well, who could stretch a budget and keep her family fed through lean months, was a woman fulfilling her social contract. It was expected, unpaid, and largely invisible, the culinary equivalent of the load-bearing wall that nobody notices because it never falls down. The food itself, though, was genuinely different. Not in a romantic, sepia-toned, everything was better way. It wasn't all better. Poor families ate poorly. Rural families relied on whatever the land and season provided, which in a bad year was not much. Access to variety was limited by geography in ways that are almost impossible to imagine today. But the food that existed was food. It had ingredients you could name. It had a clear origin. This is the chicken that lived in the yard. This is the corn from the field 2 miles down the road. This is the jam that took 4 hours to make last August and has been sitting on the shelf since. And then the war ended. The soldiers came home. The suburbs started going up like the land itself was in a hurry, and the food companies began to sense something extraordinary. A nation of exhausted, optimistic people who had money and no time, and who were just starting to believe that the future was supposed to be easier. They were right. It was going to be easier. It just wasn't going to be better. Not exactly. That conversation, though, would come later. For now, the kitchen was about to be revolutionized, whether it wanted to be or not. Here is something nobody tells you in school. The processed food revolution wasn't born in a boardroom, it was born in a trench. During World War II, the United States military had a genuinely enormous logistical problem. How do you feed millions of soldiers scattered across multiple continents without the food spoiling, rotting, or becoming a biological event in its own right? The answer was canning, dehydrating, flash freezing, and chemically preserving everything that could possibly be consumed by a human being. By the time the soldiers came home in 1945, they'd spent years eating food that had been engineered to survive anything, and the food companies noticed. The C ration and K ration, the standard field rations of the American soldier, were marvels of logistical engineering and absolute disasters as dining experiences. They contained canned meat, crackers, compressed biscuits, powdered coffee, concentrated lemon juice, and occasionally something labelled pork and beans that bore a relationship to pork and beans, roughly equivalent to the relationship between a photograph of a beach and an actual vacation. They were calorie-dense, shelf-stable, shippable across oceans, and deeply, profoundly, almost philosophically unpleasant to eat. Soldiers ate them because the alternative was not eating, and they spent significant portions of their off hours fantasizing about the food they'd have when they got home. But here is the interesting part. While the soldiers were eating their compressed crackers and dreaming of their mother's cooking, the food technologists who'd been drafted into the war effort were solving real problems. They were learning how to dehydrate eggs and still have them reconstitute into something edible. They were perfecting methods for flash freezing vegetables without destroying their cell structure. They were figuring out which chemical additives could extend shelf life without making the product taste like it had been pickled in regret. These were serious scientific advances, and they didn't disappear when the war ended. The factories that had been producing military rations were still standing. The scientists who had developed the preservation techniques were still employed. The infrastructure for manufacturing, packaging, and distributing shelf-stable food at enormous scale already existed, humming quietly looking for a new market, And conveniently, there were 100 million Americans who had just emerged from 15 years of depression and war rationing with money in their pockets, optimism in their hearts, and a genuine cultural appetite for the modern, the easy, and the new. The transition from military ration to civilian convenience food was not instantaneous, but it was remarkably fast. Technologies developed to keep soldiers alive in the Pacific were refined, repackaged, and resold to the housewife in Ohio within a decade. The dehydrated vegetables that had gone into military soup mixes became the basis for consumer dry soup products. The canning processes perfected for field rations scaled up into the industrial production lines that stocked the supermarket shelves of the 1950s. There is something slightly surreal about the whole thing when you think about it clearly. An entire generation of young men spent years eating the worst food of their lives in the service of their country, came home traumatized and hungry, and were greeted by a food industry that had spent those same years developing more shelf-stable products. The soldiers who had dreamed of home cooking came back to find that home cooking was being slowly replaced by an industrial system whose origins lay, in no small part, in the food that had made them miserable. Nobody seemed to find this ironic at the time. The future was arriving. It came in a can, and it was better than foxhole rations, which, granted, was not a particularly high bar. The pitch was genius. Genuinely, diabolically genius. Food companies in the 1950s didn't sell their products as inferior alternatives to real cooking. They sold them as freedom, liberation, progress. You didn't have to spend all afternoon in the kitchen anymore, the advertisements cheerfully announced, as if the kitchen had been a gulag and the can opener was the key. Glossy magazine spreads showed radiant women in perfectly pressed dresses presenting gleaming jello molds and casseroles made from condensed soup to their beaming families. The message was clear. A good mother used modern food. A smart woman used her time efficiently. And efficiency, in 1953, tasted like cream of mushroom soup stirred into a pound of ground beef. The advertising machinery behind the processed food boom was sophisticated in a way that deserves genuine respect, the same way you respect a magician even after you've figured out the trick. Food companies hired psychologists. They conducted consumer research. They paid careful attention to what women said they wanted, less time in the kitchen, more time with their families, and then designed advertising campaigns that framed their products as the bridge between the burden women were living and the life they deserved. This was not clumsy manipulation. It was precise, empathetic, and extraordinarily effective. Television was the crucial delivery mechanism. By the early 1950s, the television had moved from novelty to household fixture in American homes, and the food companies followed it in like a house guest who had been waiting politely on the porch. Commercials weren't just advertisements. They were small narratives, 30-second stories about women who were happy and organized and modern, whose families smiled at dinner, whose kitchens gleamed, and whose secret was always some version of "I use this product." The woman in the commercial was never tired. She was never overwhelmed. She was never standing over a stove at 6:30 in the evening wondering what to make while 3 children argued in the next room. She'd already solved that problem. The can had solved it for her. What the advertising didn't mention, what it was carefully constructed not to mention, was that the liberation being sold was partial, conditional, and arrived with its own new set of expectations. Yes, the new convenience foods reduced cooking time, but the time freed up was rarely directed toward leisure, professional ambition, or rest. It was directed toward more housework, more social obligations, more perfection in other domestic domains. The bar simply moved. You now had time to make the house spotless, to attend the PTA meeting, to bake the cake from the boxed mix and decorate it beautifully. The kitchen work got shorter, but the job description stayed the same. There's also a beautiful irony buried in the history of the cake mix, which food historians occasionally bring up and which is worth knowing about. When the first boxed cake mixes appeared, they were genuinely instant. Just add water, stir, bake. They flopped. Sales were poor, and researchers eventually determined why. Women felt guilty. The mix was too easy. It didn't feel like they were actually doing anything. So the companies modified the formula, they removed the powdered egg from the mix, and required the cook to add a fresh egg at home. Sales recovered immediately. The act of cracking one egg was enough to make the process feel like cooking. It was participation theatre, designed to resolve a guilt that the advertising had accidentally created. Which is to say, the food industry understood the psychological landscape of the American housewife in the 1950s better than almost anyone, and they used that understanding to sell a lot of cake. Long before the frozen food aisle became the fluorescent-lit cathedral of laziness it is today, there was one man standing in the Labrador wilderness in the 1920s, watching fish freeze instantly in the Arctic air and thinking, yes, this is the future. His name was Clarence Birdseye, and he was either a visionary or a man who had simply spent too long in the cold and lost the plot. The quick freezing process he developed was legitimately revolutionary. The problem was that when he tried to sell it to the American public looked at the frost-coated cardboard boxes in the grocery store and said politely but firmly, "No thank you." It would take another 20 years, a world war, and a significant investment in refrigerated grocery displays before Birdseye got the last laugh. Clarence Birdseye was, by any reasonable measure, one of the stranger figures in American food history. He was a naturalist, a fur trader, and a government employee before he became a food entrepreneur, and his path to inventing modern frozen food ran directly through the experience of living in Labrador, Canada, in the early 1920s with his family, trapping animals and trading furs in conditions that would have convinced most people to reconsider their career choices. What Birdseye noticed, the observation that changed everything, was that fish and meat frozen very quickly in the extreme Arctic cold tasted dramatically better when thawed than food that had been frozen slowly. The rapid freezing formed smaller ice crystals which didn't rupture the food's cell walls the way slow freezing did. The science was simple. The implications were enormous. He came back from Labrador and spent the rest of the decade developing a commercial flash freezing process, a system of belts and refrigerated plates that could freeze packaged food so rapidly that the quality was genuinely preserved. He filed patents. He started a company. He sold the whole enterprise to Goldman Sachs and the Postum Company, later General Foods, in 1929 for $22 million. Which was an extraordinary sum and suggests that at least some people understood what he'd invented. The public, however, was sceptical. Frozen food in the early 1930s had a reputation problem that had nothing to do with Birdseye's technology and everything to do with the slow-frozen, ice crystal-destroyed, freezer-burned products that consumers had already encountered. When you've eaten a thawed piece of fish that tastes like a wet sock wrapped in fish, the category is compromised regardless of what the new packaging says. Grocery stores also lack the refrigerated display cases needed to keep the product properly frozen, and many of them weren't willing to invest in the equipment for a product that wasn't selling. World War II rescued Birdseye's vision, though he didn't need the rescue personally since he'd already sold the company and moved on to other inventions. The war created metal shortages that made canning difficult and rationing that pushed consumers toward alternatives. Frozen food, with its military and institutional applications, received investment and infrastructure that the private market had been slow to provide. By the time the war ended and the veterans came home to the suburbs, frozen food had built enough of a distribution network to actually be available in the stores where people shopped. And then the refrigerators arrived. Big, proper refrigerators with actual freezer compartments, and the frozen food aisle bloomed. The product that had been rejected for 20 years found its moment, its infrastructure, and its audience simultaneously. Birdseye had been right all along. He was just early, which in business is often indistinguishable from being wrong, right up until it isn't. The TV dinner has an origin story so perfectly ridiculous that it almost sounds made up. In 1953, the Swanson Company found itself staring down a problem: roughly 260 tons of leftover Thanksgiving turkey sitting in refrigerated railway cars with nowhere to go. A salesman named Jerry Thomas, depending on which version of the story you believe, looked at an airline meal tray, looked at the mountain of turkey, looked at the tray again, and said, "What if we just put the food in the tray and sell it frozen?" The result was the first commercially successful TV dinner. Turkey, cornbread dressing, peas, and sweet potatoes, all sealed in a segmented aluminum tray, priced at 98 cents, and specifically marketed to be eaten in front of the television. America lost its mind in the best possible way. 10 million units sold in the first year. 10 million. That is a number that stops you mid-sentence because Swanson's internal projections had been, by multiple accounts, considerably more modest. The company had expected to sell perhaps 5,000 in the first run. Instead, American families adopted the TV dinner with the enthusiasm of people who had been waiting for exactly this product without knowing it existed. The television was new, the family dinner was traditional, and here was a product that somehow dissolved the tension between the two. A meal engineered to be eaten on a folding tray in front of the set, watching Milton Berle or I Love Lucy or whatever the evening offered, without the guilt of abandoning the dinner table entirely because technically you were still eating a complete meal, with peas. The aluminum tray was a key part of the magic. It went directly from the freezer into the oven, required no dishes, no pots, no cleanup beyond throwing the tray away, and arrived with its components already separated into compartments. The meat over here, the starch there, the vegetable cordoned off in its own section. As if even the tray understood that some people had opinions about foods touching. This was not incidental design. Swanson had thought about it. The separated compartments solved a real consumer concern and made the product feel considered, almost sophisticated, in the way that a divided airline meal tray communicates a kind of organizational competence, even when the food itself is perfectly average. The marketing language around the TV dinner was careful and clever. It was not positioned as lazy food, or as a replacement for cooking, or as something you ate when you couldn't be bothered. It was positioned as modern. It was what progressive, busy, television-watching American families ate. The tray looked futuristic. The name tied the product to the most exciting technology in the average living room. Eating a TV dinner was not an admission of defeat. It was a participation in contemporary life. What Swanson had accidentally invented beyond the product itself was a new category of eating, one where convenience was the explicit selling point rather than a hidden feature, where the format of the food was as important as the flavour, and where the meal was designed around an activity rather than the other way around. Every frozen entree, every microwavable meal, every single-serving container of food consumed while doing something else in the history of the past 70 years is a descendant of Swanson's turkey surplus problem. A 260-ton mistake that became a billion-dollar industry. Not bad for a pile of leftover bird. The 1950s canning industry looked at the world and asked one simple question. What if we put this in a can? And then they did it to everything. Soup, obviously. Vegetables, sure, but also whole chickens, entire hams, spaghetti and tomato sauce, pork brains in milk gravy. Yes, that was a real product, and yes, it came in a can, and yes, someone at a marketing meeting approved that name. The canning process had been around for over 100 years by then. But the post-war boom in kitchen technology, refrigeration, and suburban grocery stores turned canned food from a wartime necessity into a full lifestyle. Campbell's alone was selling billions of cans a year by the mid-50s, and Andy Warhol hadn't even gotten to them yet. The ambition of the canning industry in this era was genuinely something to behold. The basic canning process, sealing food in a sterilized airtight container to prevent bacterial growth, was invented in the early 19th century by a Frenchman named Nicolas Appert, who developed it in response to Napoleon's military need for preserved food and won a government prize for his trouble. By the time the American food industry got hold of it a century and a half later, the technology had been refined, scaled, and applied to an astonishing range of products with a confidence that occasionally crossed the border into hubris. The whole canned chicken deserves a moment of specific attention because it is, in its way, a kind of philosophical statement. A whole chicken inside a can. Not chicken pieces in broth, not chicken as an ingredient in a larger preparation. A whole bird, compressed to fit a cylindrical container, shelf-stable for years, requiring only a can opener and a willingness to confront the visual reality of what you had just opened. They sold. People bought them. The post-war consumer's hunger for convenience and the post-war food industry's willingness to satisfy that hunger by any available means met in the aisle of the supermarket and shook hands over the whole canned chicken. Campbell's Soup Company was, by any measure, the king of the canned food world in the 1950s, and its dominance was not accidental. Campbell's had been making canned condensed soup since the 1890s, but the post-war era transformed the product from a convenience item into a cornerstone of American cooking. The condensed format was clever in a way that still feels impressive. By removing half the water before canning, Campbell's could pack more soup into a smaller can, reduce shipping weight and cost, and create a product that, when reconstituted at home, felt slightly more like homemade because the consumer was participating in the final step. Add 1 can of water, stir and heat. You made this. The genius of Campbell's, beyond the product, was the recipe. The company printed recipes on its labels and in its advertising that used canned soup not as a soup but as an ingredient, a ready-made sauce, a flavour base, a binding agent in casseroles and sauces and gratins. Green bean casserole, which would eventually become one of the most frequently prepared Thanksgiving dishes in America, was created in 1955 by a home economist named Dorcas Riley working in Campbell's test kitchen, using Campbell's cream of mushroom soup as the sauce. One product became the foundation of an entire cooking vocabulary, and that vocabulary is still being spoken in American kitchens today, decades later, in November, with a can opener and a bag of frozen green beans. To understand 1950s food culture, you have to understand Jell-O, not just as a dessert, but as a philosophy. Jell-O was everywhere. It was in the dessert, obviously quivering in its little glass cup like a nervous guest at a formal dinner. But it was also, and this is the part that requires some courage to discuss, in the salads. Savoury Jell-O moulds containing shredded carrots, canned peas, cream cheese, olives, and in some truly experimental cases actual canned tuna were presented to families across America as the pinnacle of modern cuisine. Jell-O marketed these creations with the confidence of a civilization that had recently won a world war and was not accepting criticism. Cookbooks printed recipes. Ladies' magazines published colour photographs. Nobody asked if this was a good idea because the decade had decided it was. Jell-O had been sold to the American public since 1897, when Pearl Waite, a carpenter and cough medicine manufacturer in upstate New York, a combination of occupations that raises questions worth not asking, added fruit syrup to granulated gelatin and registered the name. The product changed hands a few times before landing with the Genesee Pure Food Company, which marketed it aggressively through free recipe booklets distributed door to door, building consumer awareness through sheer persistent presence. By the early 20th century, Jell-O was already well established. By the 1950s, it was cultural wallpaper, present at every church potluck, every family gathering, every school cafeteria, every hospital room. The gelatin itself, the structural substance that makes Jell-O, is derived from collagen extracted by boiling the bones, connective tissue, and hides of pigs and cows. This fact was not prominently featured in the advertising, which preferred to emphasize the bright colors, the cheerful flavors, and the extraordinary modernity of a dessert that set itself without any effort from the cook. The cook simply added boiling water, added cold water, poured the liquid into a mold, and waited. That was the entire recipe. Whatever emerged from the mold, whether a plain fruit-flavored dome or an architecturally ambitious savory tower containing suspended celery and shrimp, was presented at the table with the pride of accomplishment. The savory Jell-O mold is the artifact of 1950s food culture that modern people most reliably use as evidence that something had gone wrong. And it is, genuinely, hard to defend the tomato aspic ring filled with hard-boiled eggs and green olives without a great deal of historical context. But the context is available. Gelatin was understood at the time as a sophisticated ingredient, associated with French haute cuisine and the elaborate savoury jellies that had been produced in aristocratic kitchens for centuries. The democratization of gelatin in powdered flavoured form brought what had once been a technique available only to people with professional cooks into every home. The savoury mould was not a failure of taste. It was an aspiration toward elegance expressed through the only tools available to the average 1950s housewife. That the result was a wobbling cylinder of lime Jell-O containing cream cheese and crushed pineapple does not diminish the ambition. It just makes it funnier. The decline of the Jell-O mold as a serious culinary form was gradual, then sudden, and then total. By the 1970s and 80s, savoury gelatin had quietly retreated to the irony shelf, where it has lived ever since, occasionally trotted out at vintage-themed dinner parties by people who find it hilarious, and at family gatherings by grandmothers who do not find it hilarious at all and would like you to try some. The dessert versions persisted longer and maintain a real presence today. But the elaborate moulded salads of the 1950s, those architectural achievements suspended in flavoured gelatin, remain one of the decade's most vivid and bewildering food legacies. Suspended in time, you might say, quivering gently, waiting to be understood. Before the 1950s, most Americans bought their food from local bakers, butchers, farmers, and grocers. After the 1950s, they bought it from corporations with logos and advertising budgets, and research laboratories, where teams of scientists worked in white coats specifically on the question of how to make a product taste close enough to food that nobody complained. General Mills, Pillsbury, Kraft, Heinz, Del Monte. These names became as familiar as neighbours, actually more familiar, because your neighbour wasn't on television twice an hour telling you how to make dinner. The consolidation of American food production into the hands of a small number of large corporations during this decade was one of the most significant and least discussed shifts in the country's history. It changed not just what Americans ate, but how they thought about eating entirely. General Mills had started as a flour company, the Washburn Crosby Company of Minneapolis, which merged with several other milling companies in 1928 to become the giant. By the 1950s, it had expanded into almost every category of packaged food. Breakfast cereal through the Cheerios and Wheaties brands, baking mixes through the Betty Crocker line, canned goods, snack foods, and an aggressive program of new product development that treated the American kitchen as a market to be captured rather than a tradition to be respected. The test kitchen, a concept that General Mills helped, Pioneer became the engine of this expansion, a place where food scientists and home economists worked together to develop and refine products that could be manufactured at scale and sold at mass retail. Pillsbury was doing the same thing in baking. The Pillsbury Bake Off, launched in 1949, was one of the decade's most brilliant marketing manoeuvres, a national recipe competition that invited home cooks to submit original recipes using Pillsbury products, generated enormous publicity, and served the dual function of identifying new product applications and cementing the brand's relationship with the aspiration of home baking. The Bake Off was not charity. It was market research disguised as a contest, which is precisely the kind of move that defines the era. Kraft deserves special attention because it was doing something slightly different and slightly more interesting than its competitors. Rather than simply canning or packaging existing foods, Kraft was in the business of creating new foods, processed cheese products, powdered cheese sauce, macaroni and cheese in a box that had no direct equivalent in traditional cooking and therefore no natural customer loyalty to overcome. When you buy a Kraft product, you are not choosing Kraft's version of a thing you already knew how to make. You're accepting Kraft's invention of a thing that did not exist before Kraft invented it. That is a different and in some ways more powerful market position. By the mid-1950s, Kraft macaroni and cheese was selling tens of millions of boxes a year to people who had decided that the 18-minute box version was, for most Tuesday nights, a perfectly adequate substitute for something nobody was cooking from scratch anyway. What the corporate consolidation produced beyond the products themselves was a standardization of American taste at a scale that had never existed before. When a food is made by one company, in one factory, to one formula, and distributed nationally, it begins to define what that food is supposed to taste like. After a generation of eating the same canned tomato soup, the same sliced white bread, the same powdered macaroni and cheese, American consumers had developed taste preferences calibrated not to the natural variation of real food, but to the engineered consistency of industrial food. And that recalibration, quiet and gradual and mostly invisible as it was happening, turned out to be one of the most durable legacies of the entire decade. Somewhere in the early 20th century, a man decided to take the bits of cheese left over from the cheesemaking process, melt them together with emulsifying salts, pour the result into a rectangular block, wrap it in foil and sell it to the public. He called it Velveeta. And the public, bless their hearts, bought it. By the 1950s, Velveeta was not just a product, it was an institution. It melted smoothly, it never separated, it kept forever, and it produced a nacho, dip of such catastrophically satisfying quality that an entire nation decided to quietly set aside the question of whether it was technically cheese. The answer, for the record, is that it is classified as a processed cheese product, which is the food industry's version of saying close enough. Velveeta's origin is a story of industrial ingenuity solving a problem that the cheese industry hadn't fully noticed it had. Traditional cheesemaking produces a significant amount of whey and small fragments of curds that don't form into clean wheels or blocks, byproducts that had limited use and represented real economic waste. A Swiss immigrant named Emile Frey, working in upstate New York in the 19-teens, experimented with using these fragments to create a new processed product, blending them with sodium citrate and other emulsifying salts to produce a uniform, smooth, meltable mass. The result was shelf-stable at a time when most dairy products weren't, affordable at a time when real cheese was a luxury for many families, and possessed of a melting quality that natural cheese, with its tendency to break, separate and turn greasy under heat, simply couldn't match. The FDA, for its part, eventually decided that Velveeta was not technically cheese, which is why the label now reads processed cheese product rather than just cheese. This reclassification did not appear to affect sales. Americans who had grown up eating Velveeta did not stop eating it, because a regulatory body in Washington had clarified its ontological status. They kept eating it because it melted perfectly on a burger, made a sauce that clung to pasta without breaking, and produced a dip at parties that disappeared before any other dish on the table. These are not nothing qualities. These are, in the practical context of weeknight cooking and weekend entertaining, quite significant qualities. The broader processed cheese category that Velveeta anchored was one of the 1950s most significant food developments. Kraft singles, individually wrapped slices of processed cheese product designed to be peeled apart and placed directly onto sandwiches or burgers, arrived in the early 50s and transformed the American cheese drawer forever. The single slice solved a specific problem. Natural cheese, when sliced thin, tended to dry out, crumble, or stick together in ways that were annoying in a sandwich context. The processed slice didn't do any of those things. It was consistent, pliable, and melted evenly under heat. It was also, nutritionally, a fairly distant relative of actual cheese, but it sat perfectly between two pieces of bread, and in the 1950s, that was the relevant criterion. What Velveeta and its processed cheese cousins represented in the larger story was the moment when food processing stopped being about preservation and started being about engineering, about designing a product to have specific functional properties rather than simply capturing the properties of a natural ingredient. You weren't preserving cheese, you were building something that performed like cheese, looked like cheese, and tasted enough like cheese that the distinction didn't matter in the context of a hot casserole. Whether that distinction should have mattered is a question the 1950s was not particularly interested in asking. The casserole was in the oven, the family was at the table, and the dip was disappearing. That was enough. Wonder Bread was introduced to America in 1930 with a name that turned out to be aspirational in ways its creators never intended. By the 1950s, it was the dominant loaf in the country, white, soft, perfectly uniform, sliced to a precise thickness, and enriched with added vitamins because the refining process that made it so soft and white had also stripped out most of the nutritional content that bread is supposed to contain, so they put some of it back, partially, enough to print it on the label. The loaf lasted for days without going stale, which was either a triumph of food science or a deeply unsettling fact about what was happening inside the bag, depending on your perspective. Americans largely chose the first interpretation because the bread made excellent sandwiches and was very soft on the teeth. The story of Wonder Bread is, at its core, the story of what happens when you optimize a food for the wrong things. White bread had been a status symbol for centuries. The whiter the flour, the more refined the milling, the more expensive the loaf, and American consumers in the 20th century brought that preference with them, even as the economics of milling shifted and white flour became cheap rather than expensive. The desire for white bread was historical and cultural, and the food industry was happy to satisfy it. The Taggart Baking Company, which introduced Wonder Bread under the Continental Baking brand, had perfected a process for producing a loaf so white, so uniform, and so soft that it represented a kind of platonic ideal of the industrially produced food object. The softness was achieved through a combination of highly refined flour, added fats, emulsifiers, and a careful management of the fermentation process that gave the bread a fine, even crumb structure, with no variation, no holes, no surprises. This is bread designed to be inoffensive to the maximum possible number of people. Bread from which everything challenging or interesting about bread has been removed and replaced with smoothness. It is the dietary equivalent of a film that scores 7 out of 10 on every metric and 10 out of 10 on none. It is aggressively adequate, and it's sold in staggering quantities. The enrichment program that added vitamins back to refined white bread was, in the context of its time, a genuine public health intervention. Nutritional deficiency diseases caused by inadequate B vitamin intake, pellagra, bayberry, had been real problems in parts of America, and the fortification of white bread and flour with niacin, thiamine, riboflavin and iron in the 1940s addressed those deficiencies effectively. The fortification worked. The deficiency diseases declined. This is a real success story. What is also true is that the logic of enrichment, strip the nutrition out, add some back, call it enriched, became a template that the food industry would apply to product after product in the decades that followed, with diminishing returns and increasing absurdity. You would add vitamins to breakfast cereals that were primarily sugar. You would fortify snack foods with minerals. You would produce a product so processed that it required a laboratory to restore it to approximate nutritional equivalence with something you could have just grown in a field. Wonder Bread was not the cause of all of this. It was the early, clear, unavoidable demonstration of the principle. The rest would follow naturally. If the 1950s had a food motto, it would be just add water, instant coffee, instant soup, instant mashed potatoes, which arrived courtesy of a Canadian inventor named Edward Asselbergs in 1962, but were perfected and mass-marketed through the preceding decade of industrial food development. The concept was straightforward. Take a food, remove all the water from it, seal it in a packet, and instruct the consumer to rehydrate it at home. The result was convenience so radical that it bordered on the philosophical. Your mashed potato had crossed the country in a cardboard box, been stored on a shelf for months, and then been reconstituted in your kitchen in under 2 minutes. Whether the result tasted like a potato was, the food companies would argue, a question of attitude. Instant coffee was the category that perhaps best illustrates both the ambition and the strange cultural confidence of the era. Coffee, as any reasonable person who has ground beans and brewed a proper pot will tell you, is a product that rewards patience. The flavour is volatile, sensitive to temperature, dependent on freshness, and easily ruined by shortcuts. Instant coffee acknowledges none of this. Instant coffee takes brewed coffee, removes all the water from it through spray drying or freeze drying, and produces a powder that, when combined with hot water, produces something that is technically coffee, in the same way that a photograph of a campfire is technically fire. It is coffee's administrative representative. It handles the paperwork but lacks the warmth of the original. Nescafé had been selling instant coffee since 1938, but the post-war boom transformed it from a wartime staple into a daily household ritual for millions of Americans. By the mid-1950s, Maxwell House and Folgers were both heavily invested in their own instant lines, and the morning coffee routine in a significant portion of American homes had been compressed from a 10-minute brewing process to a 90-second kettle operation. This was positioned as an unambiguous improvement. Time had been saved. Convenience had been achieved. Whether the coffee in the cup was enjoyable was, again, a matter of attitude, and the advertising suggested that the correct attitude was gratitude. Lipton's instant soup mix deserves mention here because it represented a slightly different application of the dehydration principle, one that required the consumer to do even less than the instant coffee drinker. You did not need to own any equipment. You did not need a kettle or a cup in any particular configuration. You needed a packet, some hot water, and the basic motor skills required to stir. The result was a liquid that bore a passing resemblance to soup, in the way that a stick figure bears a passing resemblance to a human being. The essential features are present, arranged in roughly the right relationship, but something is clearly missing, and you can't quite stop noticing it. And yet the instant soup category exploded. because the 1950s consumer was not primarily asking the question, is this delicious? They were asking, does this solve the problem? And the problem, in a decade of working fathers and exhausted mothers and children who needed to be fed at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday, was not that soup was unavailable. It was that soup took time. The packet eliminated the time. The flavour was a secondary consideration that could be addressed, the food companies promised, by the addition of crackers, which came in their own box on the shelf next to the soup packets, which was not an accident. The dehydration of America was, in the end, a triumph of logistics over gastronomy. What the instant food category proved was that a large number of people, given the choice between a delicious thing that took effort and an adequate thing that took 30 seconds, would choose the adequate thing most of the time. Not because they didn't care about food, but because caring about food requires time, and time was the one resource that the 1950s could not manufacture, package and sell. Everything else, it turned out, was negotiable. None of the processed food boom would have mattered without a place to sell it. And that place, rising across suburban America in the 1950s like cathedrals of commerce, was the supermarket. These weren't the small neighbourhood grocery stores of previous decades. They were enormous, self-service temples of abundance, stocked floor to ceiling with hundreds and then thousands of products, most of them packaged, branded and shelf-stable. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Shopping carts rolled across linoleum floors. Families loaded up on things they hadn't known existed the week before, guided by colourful packaging and strategically placed end-cap displays. The supermarket didn't just sell food, it sold an idea that modern life came with this much choice, this much ease, this much colour, and that all of it fit neatly in a cart. The self-service grocery store was not a 1950s invention. Piggly Wiggly had introduced the concept in Memphis, Tennessee, back in 1916, replacing the old model of asking a clerk to retrieve every item from behind a counter with the radical idea that customers could simply walk the aisles and take things off shelves themselves. But the post-war suburban explosion and the rise of the automobile transformed the concept from a modest retail innovation into the dominant form of food shopping in America. New suburbs required new stores, and the stores that got built were large, parking lot equipped, and stocked for the weekly shop rather than the daily errand. The weekly shop was itself a new behaviour, made possible by the combination of the automobile and the modern refrigerator. When you could drive a large car to a large store and fill it with food, then store that food in a large home refrigerator for 7 days, the daily market trip became unnecessary and eventually quaint. The housewife who had once visited the butcher on Monday, the baker on Tuesday, and the greengrocer on Wednesday now did everything in one place on Saturday morning. The supermarket compressed the entire food supply chain into a single building and a single trip, and the consumer experienced this as pure liberation, which it was to a significant degree, and also as a controlled environment designed by retail scientists to maximize the number of items that ended up in the cart, which it also was, to an equally significant degree. The layout of the supermarket was not casual. The bread and milk, the items most people needed most regularly, were placed at the back of the store, requiring customers to traverse the entire floor to reach them. The fresh produce was positioned at the entrance, because the sight and smell of fresh food created a positive first impression that made shoppers more willing to spend. The snack foods and impulse items were placed at eye level and at the ends of aisles. The checkout lanes were lined with small, affordable, brightly packaged items that could be added to the cart without a decision, a category now known as impulse purchases and then known more simply as things that ended up in the cart. The supermarket also changed what food looked like. When food is sold from a shelf in a package rather than from a barrel, a counter or a produce stand, it needs packaging, bright, legible, attractive packaging that communicates its identity from a distance and competes for attention against the 50 other packages on the same shelf. The packaging arms race that began in the 1950s produced the visual language of the modern grocery store. The bold logo, the appetite-stimulating photograph, the cheerful colour scheme, the selling proposition printed in large type above the ingredient list printed in small type. The food had to look like something you wanted before you even knew what it was. That requirement shaped not just marketing but the food itself, selecting for products that photographed well, travelled without damage, and remained visually appealing for the duration of their shelf life, which was, ideally, a very long time. At some point in the 1950s and 60s, American food scientists decided that juice, actual juice, pressed from actual fruit, was too complicated, too perishable, and frankly too reasonable. What if instead you could give people a powder and they could mix it with water at home and it would taste sort of like fruit in the way that a photograph of a fireplace sort of feels like warmth? Tang was developed by General Foods in 1957. Kool-Aid had been around since the 20s but exploded in popularity during this era. The pitch was beautiful in its simplicity. Cheaper than juice, easier than juice, brighter than juice. A colour that juice simply does not achieve in nature. And if there were no actual vitamins in it, well, vitamins could be added. That was what the enriched part of the label was for. Kool-Aid's origin is modest and American in the best possible way. Edwin Perkins of Hastings, Nebraska, developed it in 1927 by taking a liquid concentrate called fruit smack and dehydrating it into a powder that could be mailed cheaply and mixed at home. The Great Depression made Kool-Aid genuinely important. At 2 packets for a penny during the worst years, it was one of the few flavoured beverages that families with very little money could actually afford. By the 1950s, it had recovered from the Depression context and was being marketed aggressively to children through the Kool-Aid Man, a pitcher of red liquid with a face and limbs who solved problems by bursting through walls, which is either an exciting mascot concept or a concerning behavioural model, depending on how you look at it. Tang occupies a slightly more exalted position in the powder beverage hierarchy, largely because of NASA. General Foods developed Tang in 1957, and it was selected for use on NASA's early manned space missions in the early 1960s because it was lightweight, non-perishable, and easy to prepare in a spacecraft. The association with space travel was marketing gold of a quality that money couldn't buy, because money hadn't bought it. It had been bestowed by the federal government's space program. Tang did not become the official drink of astronauts because it was better than orange juice. It became the official drink of astronauts because it was powdered and convenient and fit the specific logistical requirements of space travel. But the American consumer didn't need to know that. They just needed to know that astronauts drank it, and from that moment every child who mixed a glass of Tang in their kitchen was doing something adjacent to space exploration. The deeper phenomenon that Tang and Kool-Aid represented was a fundamental redefinition of what a beverage could be. Historically, a drink was something that existed: water, milk, juice, tea, coffee, alcohol, and you consumed it. The powdered drink category introduced the idea of a drink that was first a powder, then became a drink when the consumer added water at home. The consumer was now, in a small but real sense, manufacturing their own beverage. They had participated in its creation, and because the powder was engineered in a laboratory to produce a specific flavour profile when dissolved in water, the resulting drink was more consistent, more intense, and more reliably sweet than anything nature produced on its own. Which meant that over time, children raised on Tang and Kool-Aid developed taste expectations for juice, that actual juice, with its variable sweetness and subtle tartness and occasional bitterness, could not always meet. This is how processed food changes taste. Not through any single dramatic moment, but through daily repetition, through the accumulated, experience of a generation reaching for the powder first, the real thing second, and eventually finding the real thing somehow slightly disappointing. The orange didn't change, the expectation did. Spam arrived in 1937 and spent World War II becoming one of the most consumed foods on the planet. Fed to Allied soldiers, supplied to civilians across Europe and the Pacific, and embedded so deeply into the food cultures of Hawaii, South Korea, the Philippines, and the United Kingdom that it never fully left. By the 1950s, Spam was everywhere in American pantries, tucked next to the canned beans and the condensed soups as a permanent member of the household larder. It was pork, salt, water, modified starch, and sodium nitrite, all packed into a rectangular tin with a key on the side for opening. What cut of pork exactly? The company preferred the phrase pork with ham, which is either reassuring or the opposite, depending on how much you enjoy mysteries. Spam was invented by J. Hormel, son of the founder of the Hormel Foods Corporation, and introduced at a party in 1936 where guests were invited to submit name suggestions. The winning entry, Spam, was submitted by an actor named Kenneth Daigneault, who collected $100 for his trouble, and whose contribution to American culinary vocabulary turned out to be substantially more durable than his acting career. The name was either a contraction of spiced ham or shoulder of pork and ham, depending on which corporate history you consult, and Hormel has declined to officially clarify the matter, which suggests they may find the ambiguity useful. The product itself is a masterpiece of industrialized protein delivery. It is shelf-stable at room temperature for years. It requires no refrigeration before opening. It comes pre-cooked, meaning the consumer needs only to slice and heat it, or eat it directly from the tin if the situation calls for that level of efficiency. It is cheap relative to fresh meat, consistent in flavour, available everywhere, and adaptable to an enormous range of preparations, fried with eggs, cubed in fried rice, sliced for sandwiches, glazed and baked as a centerpiece for occasions that may have had limited access to alternatives. It does everything asked of it without complaint, which is more than can be said for a number of more expensive and prestigious food products. The class dynamics around Spam in the 1950s were complicated in ways that still echo. Among middle-class American consumers in the continental United States, Spam had acquired an association with wartime scarcity and institutional food, military rations, school cafeterias, relief supplies, that made it slightly embarrassing as the country grew more prosperous. Eating Spam when you could afford something else suggested that perhaps you couldn't afford something else. And in a decade when prosperity and consumption were deeply linked to social identity, that suggestion was worth avoiding. Spam quietly retreated from aspirational middle-class tables, even as it remained a pantry staple in working-class and rural households. Simultaneously, in Hawaii, in South Korea, in the Philippines and the United Kingdom, places where Spam had arrived via military supply chains and had been incorporated into local cuisines with genuine creativity and affection, it was becoming something completely different. A beloved ingredient, a cultural touchstone, a product around which real cooking traditions developed. The Hawaiian Spam musubi, the Korean budai jjigae, the British Spam fritter. These were not ironic preparations or poverty food. They were simply food, made with an available ingredient and cooked with skill. The embarrassment that attached to Spam in mainstream American culture in the 50s said less about the product than it did about the anxieties of a particular social class at a particular moment in a particular country. The rest of the world, less interested in what Spam said about their status, was simply eating it and finding it perfectly fine. Betty Crocker was not a real person. She was invented in 1921 by the Washburn Crosby Company, later General Mills, as a friendly, trustworthy female face to put on their flour products and recipe communications. By the 1950s, she had a radio show, a television program, a cookbook that sold in the tens of millions, and a portrait that had been updated 8 times to ensure she remained appropriately modern and non-threatening. Millions of American women wrote to Betty Crocker for cooking advice and received replies. They felt they knew her. They trusted her. She was, in the marketing language of the era, a friend, a fictional friend employed by a corporation to build brand loyalty through the careful simulation of warmth. It worked spectacularly. The Betty Crocker origin story begins with a promotional contest. In 1921, the Washburn Crosby Company ran a competition asking customers to complete a jigsaw puzzle of a milling scene. The response was overwhelming, and company executives decided that the letters accompanying the submissions should receive a personal reply rather than a form response. A female name was chosen to sign those replies, the thinking being that cooking questions were best answered by a woman, and Betty Crocker was assembled from the surname of a recently retired director, and the first name selected from a staff competition because it sounded friendly. From this entirely practical and fairly cynical beginning, a cultural institution was constructed over the following 3 decades. The 1950s were Betty Crocker's peak cultural moment. The Betty Crocker Cookbook, first published in 1950, sold more copies in the decade than any cookbook before it. The Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook, known in homes across America simply as the red and white cookbook for its distinctive cover, became the standard reference for the post-war American housewife, in the way that a dictionary is the reference for language, the first place you turned when you didn't know what you were doing, and the authority that settled arguments. It sold millions of copies in the first year alone. It taught a generation of women, many of whom had not had mothers with time to teach them traditional cooking, having grown up during the Depression and the war, how to cook in the style of the new American kitchen, which meant using packaged ingredients, canned goods, and General Mills products at every possible opportunity. The portrait of Betty Crocker was updated periodically to keep her current, and each revision was treated as something between a corporate announcement and a minor cultural event. She was always white, always middle-aged, always professionally dressed, always composed and competent looking in a way that communicated authority without threatening any of the social hierarchies she was designed to operate within. She was never too young, which would have implied inexperience, never too old, which would have implied irrelevance, never too beautiful, which might have seemed impractical. She occupied a precise social position, the knowledgeable older friend, the trusted advisor, the woman who had already figured out the problem you were currently having, and she held that position with remarkable consistency across decades. What Betty Crocker represented, beyond the brand mechanics, was the industrialization of culinary authority. Cooking knowledge had historically been transmitted, person to person, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, through demonstration and practice, and the accumulated wisdom of lived experience. Betty Crocker replaced that transmission chain with a centralized, corporate-controlled, nationally distributed set of instructions that directed everyone toward the same techniques, the same products, and the same outcomes. It was efficient, it was accessible, and it quietly shifted the locus of culinary authority from the family kitchen to the corporate test kitchen, a shift whose consequences are still being negotiated today. The casserole was not invented in the 1950s, but the 1950s perfected it into a cultural institution. The formula was simple and nearly infinitely variable. A protein, a starch, a vegetable, a binding agent almost always provided by a can of Campbell's condensed soup, topped with something crunchy, crushed crackers, fried onions, potato chips, and baked until the edges bubbled and the top turned an appealing shade of golden brown. The result was filling, affordable, easy, and could feed an entire family from a single dish. It was also, food historians would note decades later, a paradigm-shifting moment in American cuisine, the point at which the can of soup stopped being an ingredient and started being the recipe. The casserole's rise to dominance was a perfect convergence of product, infrastructure, and social circumstance. Campbell's had been quietly printing recipe suggestions using condensed soup as a source base since the 1930s, but it was in the post-war era, as the suburban kitchen filled up with modern appliances and the supermarket shelf filled up with Campbell's products, that the casserole truly came into its own. The company's test kitchen developed recipes with a clarity of purpose that bordered on evangelical. Here is a dish you can make tonight, from things you already have in your pantry, in one container, in under an hour, that your family will eat without complaint. This was not a culinary vision. It was a solution to a logistics problem, and it worked. The green bean casserole, as previously mentioned, was created in 1955 in Campbell's test kitchen by home economist Dorcas Riley. The brief she'd been given was to develop a recipe that used two things most Americans had in their kitchens at any given time: canned green beans and canned cream of mushroom soup. The French fried onions on top were added for texture and visual interest. The whole dish took under an hour from pantry to table. Riley did not think she was creating a classic. She was solving a problem on a deadline. The fact that her solution ended up being prepared in 20 million American homes every Thanksgiving for the next 70 years suggests she solved it rather well. The casserole democratized entertaining in a way that had genuine social value. Before the packaged ingredient era, preparing food for a gathering required either professional cooking skills, household help, or enormous amounts of time. The casserole removed all three requirements simultaneously. You could bring a tuna noodle casserole to a potluck dinner, a funeral reception, a church social, or a new neighbour's welcome gathering without any particular skill, any significant expense, or more than an hour of preparation. The dish travelled well in its baking pan, reheated without protest, and could be scaled up or down by adjusting the number of cans. It was the culinary equivalent of a reliable compact car, not glamorous, not exciting, but it gets everyone where they're going without incident. The tuna noodle casserole deserves its own moment because it is perhaps the purest expression of the form: egg noodles, canned tuna, canned cream of mushroom soup, frozen peas, topped with crushed potato chips or breadcrumbs, every ingredient from a can or a bag. Total preparation time approximately 20 minutes before baking. The result is a dish that is simultaneously unpretentious and completely representative of an entire era of American home cooking, a culinary selfie of the 1950s, slightly pale and beige and deeply sincere, asking nothing more of the person who makes it than that they own a casserole dish and a can opener. Millions of people ate it, most of them on weeknights, and many of them remember it with genuine fondness. That is not nothing. That is, in its way, everything. Breakfast cereal existed before the 1950s, but in the post-war decade it transformed into something its original inventors, who were famously 19th century health reformers advocating for bland, unsweetened grain products to suppress sinful urges, would have been unable to recognize and possibly horrified by. Sugar cereals arrived with mascots, prizes in the boxes, television commercials aimed directly at children, and sugar content that in some cases exceeded 40% by weight. Tony the Tiger, Snap, Crackle, and Pop, Cap'n Crunch, Toucan Sam. These were not just cereal characters, they were part of a decade-long campaign to redefine breakfast as something children should have strong opinions about, and parents should buy based on those opinions. It worked. The health food origins of breakfast cereal are genuinely remarkable and should be more widely known because they add a layer of delicious irony to what the category eventually became. John Harvey Kellogg, yes, that Kellogg was a physician and health reformer running the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan in the late 19th century, where he treated patients with a regimen of exercise, hydrotherapy, and a strictly vegetarian diet designed to discourage what he considered the moral and physical hazards of excessive meat consumption, and, more specifically, of the sexual urges he believed red meat provoked. Cornflakes were invented as part of this regimen. They were supposed to be boring. That was the point. The blandness was the feature. His brother William, sensing a commercial opportunity that John's moral framework refused to see, added sugar to the cornflakes formula and launched a breakfast cereal company. John was furious. William became wealthy. History did not have to think very long about which outcome it preferred to extend. By the post-war era, William's descendants in the cereal industry had moved well beyond adding a modest amount of sugar to cornflakes. General Mills introduced Sugar Smacks in 1953 with a sugar content of approximately 56% by weight, a number that, when you encounter it in print, requires a brief pause to process. More than half of the product by weight was sugar. It was not a breakfast food that happened to be sweet. It was a delivery mechanism for sugar that happened to be shaped like a cereal. It came in a box with a cartoon frog on it, and tasted like something a dentist would describe as evidence. The role of television in the sugar cereal explosion cannot be overstated. Children's television programming in the 1950s was a new and largely unregulated space, and cereal companies moved into it with the speed and enthusiasm of an army that has just discovered an undefended border. Saturday morning cartoons were sponsored by cereal brands. Characters were developed specifically for television advertising. The relationship between the cereal box and the TV screen was so tight and so consistent that it formed a closed loop. The child watched the commercial, demanded the cereal, found the prize in the box, and associated the entire experience with the pleasure of Saturday morning. You were not buying a breakfast food. You were buying a feeling, a routine, a small weekly ritual that tasted like sugar and came with a toy. By the time the pediatric dentistry profession had fully registered what was happening, an entire generation's molars had already formed an opinion. The 1950s were a complicated decade for nutrition science. On one hand, researchers were making genuine progress, identifying vitamins and their deficiencies, beginning to understand the relationship between diet and chronic disease, developing the first real frameworks for thinking about what a healthy diet might look like. On the other hand, the food industry was paying close attention to this research and had developed a remarkably useful strategy for responding to it: enrichment. If the refining process stripped out nutrients, put some back in, and print it on the label. If a study suggested a food might be unhealthy, fund a different study. The relationship between the emerging nutrition science establishment and the food corporations that fed America in the 1950s was complicated, financially entangled, and would take decades to fully untangle. Ancel Keys was the most important nutritionist of the 1950s, and his work illustrates both the promise and the problem of the era's nutritional science. Keys conducted research, including the landmark 7-country study that linked dietary saturated fat to cardiovascular disease, an association that has been refined, contested, and debated by researchers ever since. His work was genuinely significant and helped establish the field of nutritional epidemiology. It also had the unfortunate effect of launching a decades-long national obsession with fat reduction that the food industry enthusiastically supported and exploited, because replacing fat in food is easier and cheaper than the alternative, and because low-fat labelling could be applied to products that had replaced fat with sugar without anyone initially noticing the substitution. The food industry's engagement with nutrition science in this era was not straightforwardly dishonest. Some of it was genuine. Companies did add vitamins to their products, and those vitamins did address real deficiencies. The fortification of bread and milk, as previously discussed, reduced the incidence of nutritional deficiency diseases, These were real public health achievements. The problem was that the language of nutrition was also exceptionally useful for marketing, and the difference between a health claim made in good faith and a health claim made primarily to sell product was not always clear, not to the consumer, not always to the regulator, and arguably not always to the food company itself. The recommended daily allowance system developed by the government during World War II to ensure that military personnel and the civilian population were getting adequate nutrition was adopted by the food industry as a labelling framework almost immediately, and applied to products with a creative flexibility that the system's creators had not entirely anticipated. A cereal could claim to provide 25% of your daily requirement of several vitamins and minerals regardless of what else it contained. The percentage was accurate. The impression that the cereal was therefore a healthy food was, in many cases, a significant overstatement. But the label said 25%, and 25% sounded like progress. And the advertising said it was good for growing children, and in the 1950s nobody had yet developed the reflex to read the sugar content line immediately after. What nutrition science gave the 1950s food industry was a language of legitimacy, a vocabulary of health and progress and scientific advancement that could be attached to products that were primarily engineered for palatability, shelf life, and manufacturability. The science was real. The application was selective. The consumer navigating a grocery store for the first time in history and being offered 100 products they had never encountered before was not well positioned to evaluate the difference. That was quietly the point. In the 1950s, food advertising entered a golden age of extraordinary shamelessness. Television was new, its reach was enormous, and food companies poured money into commercials that made the act of opening a can of soup look like a genuinely emotional event. Jingles burrowed into the brain and refused to leave. Slogans became cultural touchstones. Brand characters, the Jolly Green Giant, the Pillsbury Doughboy, arriving just after the decade's end. Mr. Clean, the Campbell's Kids, were designed with the care of fine art and the precision of psychological manipulation. The goal was not simply to sell a product. The goal was to make the product feel like family, to associate the logo with warmth, safety, mother, home, and all the emotional furniture that advertisers knew they could monetize. The advertising industry of the 1950s was operating at the intersection of two new capabilities that had never previously existed simultaneously: the reach of national television broadcasting and the insights of modern consumer psychology. Before television, national advertising meant magazines and radio, powerful but limited in their ability to deliver emotional experience. Television delivered moving images and sound directly into the living room, which turned out to be an extraordinarily effective environment for building emotional associations. You were relaxed, you were with your family, the light was warm, and into that environment, carefully calibrated to seem just like your environment, came a woman who looked like your mother and spoke like your neighbour, and told you what she served her family for dinner. The jingle was the decade's most potent advertising weapon. A well-constructed jingle, melodically simple, lyrically repetitive, attached to a product name that appeared in both the first and last lines, could install itself in the human memory with a persistence that most people's actual intentions did not achieve. The Armour hot dog jingle, good for Campbell's. The Oscar Mayer Wiener song, which arrived in 1963 but was the product of a decade's worth of jingle science. These were not accidents of creativity. They were engineered to be memorable, and they succeeded so thoroughly that adults who had heard them as children in the 1950s could reproduce them verbatim 50 years later. The hot dog, as a food product, had done nothing to earn this level of neural real estate. The jingle had simply moved in without asking. The brand character was the other major innovation of the era. The Jolly Green Giant, the mascot for the Green Giant Company's canned and frozen vegetables, had been around since the 1920s, but was transformed in the 1950s into a fully realised character with a personality, a visual identity, and a television presence. He was cheerful, enormous, and associated with green things growing in valleys, which successfully distracted from the fact that the product was vegetables that had been canned or frozen, and might therefore require some positive emotional scaffolding to sell to children. Tony the Tiger, introduced in 1952 as the mascot for Kellogg's Sugar Frosted Flakes, told children directly and emphatically that the cereal was great, a claim that could not be verified, disputed, or regulated, but that was delivered with such conviction by a large animated tiger that children accepted it as authoritative. What the advertising of the 1950s established, beyond the specific sales of specific products, was a template for the relationship between food companies and consumers that has persisted ever since. Food is not just fuel. It is identity, comfort, belonging, aspiration, memory, and love. And all of those things can be attached to a product through consistent and skillful advertising, regardless of the product's actual qualities. The brand is the feeling, the food is the vehicle, and once that relationship is established early enough in a person's life, through the cereal character, the jingle, the television commercial watched on Saturday morning, it tends to persist with a loyalty that more rational purchasing criteria cannot easily displace. In the 1950s, kitchen appliances were not just tools, they were declarations. A new refrigerator with a built-in freezer compartment, a modern electric range, a stand mixer in avocado green or harvest gold, these were proof that a family had arrived, that the post-war prosperity was real, that the future had delivered on its promises. Kitchen appliance manufacturers understood this perfectly and marketed accordingly, sponsoring television programs, placing products in magazine spreads alongside cheerful housewives, and linking the idea of modern kitchen equipment inseparably to the idea of being a good, modern, forward-thinking American family. The kitchen became the most important room in the house, not because of what happened in it, but because of what it said about the people who owned it. The refrigerator was the decade's most totemic appliance. Earlier generations had made do with the icebox, a wooden cabinet cooled by a block of ice delivered regularly by the iceman, which required drip trays, regular replacement, and the ongoing cooperation of a local ice delivery service. The modern electric refrigerator replaced all of this with a sealed, self-contained, thermostatically controlled machine that asked nothing of the owner except to be plugged in and occasionally wiped down. It was large, white, and clean in a way that the icebox had never been. It hummed quietly. It kept things cold indefinitely. It was the future standing in the kitchen, and it was available for purchase on an installment plan that put it within reach of the expanding middle class. General Electric, Frigidaire, Westinghouse, and Hotpoint competed for the refrigerator market with a product design philosophy that treated the kitchen appliance as an object of aspiration rather than utility. Refrigerators grew larger across the decade as the suburban house grew larger and the weekly grocery shop grew more ambitious. The separate freezer compartment, and later the side-by-side refrigerator-freezer configuration, made the frozen food category viable for everyday use. The crisper drawer, the butter conditioner, the egg rack built into the door, these features were not engineering, necessities. They were consumer reassurances, evidence that the appliance understood your kitchen and had been designed by people who took your domestic situation seriously. The kitchen's elevation to status symbol had a deeply gendered dimension that was, in the 1950s, almost entirely unremarked upon because it was so thoroughly assumed. The kitchen was the woman's domain. Its modernity reflected her values. Its efficiency expressed her competence. The new appliances were sold to women, but purchase decisions were often made jointly, and the refrigerator or range that a family chose communicated something about the husband's earning power as much as the wife's domestic standard. The kitchen was a performance space visible to guests, photographed for holiday cards, discussed over the fence with neighbours, and the appliances were the props. Nixon and Khrushchev famously conducted their kitchen debate in 1959 at a model American home displayed at an exhibition in Moscow, arguing over the merits of their respective economic systems while standing in front of an American kitchen stocked with appliances. Nixon's argument, in essence, was that American capitalism had produced this kitchen, with these machines available to the average American worker, and that this was evidence of capitalism's superiority over communism. The kitchen, in other words, had become geopolitically significant. The refrigerator had become a political argument, and the food inside it, processed, packaged, shelf-stable, convenient, produced by corporations available in a supermarket, was the evidence being presented to the world as the fruit of the American way of life. The ingredient lists on processed foods in the 1950s were long, technical, and deeply optimistic about the human body's tolerance for synthetic chemistry. Sodium benzoate, butylated hydroxyanisole, BHA, artificial colours with names like yellow number 5 and red number 40, monosodium, glutamate, which arrived from Japan and was enthusiastically adopted by the American food industry for its ability to make almost anything taste more savoury and compelling. These additives were approved by the FDA, declared safe, and incorporated into products at a scale and speed that made long-term study essentially impossible. The regulatory framework that existed was largely designed to prevent acute poisoning, not to ask what happened if you ate these compounds every day for 40 years. That question would take a few more decades to become inconvenient. The additives in 1950s processed food fell into several broad categories, each solving a different problem that the food industry had created by deciding to manufacture food at industrial scale and distribute it across continental distances on a shelf-life timeline measured in months. Preservatives prevented bacterial and fungal growth in products that would otherwise spoil quickly, which sounds straightforwardly beneficial until you consider that a food product requiring that much chemical intervention to remain shelf-stable for 6 months is a food product that has been quite thoroughly transformed from its natural state. Antioxidants prevented fats from going rancid during the long journey from factory to pantry. Emulsifiers kept oil and water mixed together in products where they would naturally separate. Stabilizers maintained texture. Thickeners provided body. Humectants retained moisture. Each additive was solving a specific engineering problem, and together they were solving the general problem of how to make something that was supposed to be food behave like a manufactured product. The artificial colour story is particularly instructive. Food colouring had been used in commercial food products since the late 19th century, when the initial synthetic dyes, derived from coal tar, a byproduct of coal processing, were introduced to make products look more appealing. By the 1950s, the palette had expanded considerably, and the application had become more aggressive. Maraschino cherries were dyed a red so vivid it appeared to come from another dimension. Margarine, which in its natural state is an off-white substance, was dyed yellow to resemble butter, because consumers had a negative reaction to spreading a pale, lard-like material on their toast. The yellow dye was added not to improve the product, but to manage the consumer's psychological response to it. You were not eating yellow margarine, you were eating white margarine that had been told to pretend. Monosodium glutamate occupies a special position in the additive story, because it was genuinely effective at its stated purpose in a way that made its widespread adoption almost inevitable. MSG is the sodium salt of glutamic acid, an amino acid that occurs naturally in many foods, aged cheese, cured meats, tomatoes, mushrooms, and is responsible for what Japanese chemist Kikunae Ikeda identified in 1908 as umami, the fifth basic taste alongside sweet, salty, sour, and bitter. Adding MSG to a food product increased its perceived savoury depth and richness in ways that were real, not imagined, and that made products taste better in blind taste tests. The food industry adopted it enthusiastically. It was put into canned soups, snack foods, frozen dinners, seasoning packets, and processed meats across the decade. The subsequent history of MSG, the unfounded health scares, the xenophobic associations, the decades of undeserved stigma is a separate story. In the 1950s, it was simply a useful tool, deployed without particular fanfare, alongside the dozens of other compounds being quietly stirred into the American food supply. Nobody was hiding any of it. It was on the label, in the small print, available to anyone who wanted to read it. The assumption was simply that nobody would, and for the most part, nobody did. In 1946, the National School Lunch Act created a federal program to provide low-cost or free lunches to American schoolchildren. It was, genuinely, a compassionate and important policy. It was also, by the 1950s, one of the largest single purchasers of processed and surplus agricultural food in the country. Commodity cheese, canned fruit in syrup, tater tots, invented in 1953 by Ore-Ida to use up potato scraps, fish sticks, rectangular pizza. The school cafeteria of the 1950s and 60s became the defining food experience of a generation. Not because the food was good, but because it was everywhere, inescapable, and arrived at noon every weekday for 12 years straight. Many of those children grew up to think of processed food as normal food, because for them, it simply was. The National School Lunch Program had its roots not primarily in concern for children's nutrition, but in concern for agricultural surplus and military readiness. The agricultural surplus problem was real and persistent. American farms, made dramatically more productive by mechanization and modern inputs, were consistently producing more food than the market could absorb at prices that kept farmers financially viable. The government purchased this surplus to stabilize farm prices, and the school lunch program was partly a mechanism for distributing it, a way of converting an agricultural policy problem into a social welfare benefit, which is a political maneuver elegant enough to deserve some admiration regardless of its nutritional consequences. The military readiness angle sounds strange today, but was genuinely influential in the policy debates of the 1940s. Military officials had reported that a significant number of young men presenting for service in World War II had been rejected for physical reasons related to malnutrition. They were too thin, too small, too vitamin deficient, reflecting the dietary consequences of the Depression years. A school lunch program was presented in part as an investment in the future military capacity of the country. Well-fed children became fit soldiers. This framing gave the program bipartisan support and a budget that pure nutritional altruism might not have generated on its own. By the 1950s, the program was feeding millions of children daily, and the food it served reflected its procurement realities as much as its nutritional intentions. Surplus commodity foods, blocks of processed cheese, canned vegetables, dried milk powder, canned meats formed the backbone of the cafeteria menu. The kitchens preparing these lunches were institutional operations designed for volume and consistency rather than culinary quality, staffed by workers following standardized recipes developed centrally and applied identically across thousands of schools. The result was a food experience characterized by uniformity, beige to brown color palettes, and flavors that were filling without being memorable in any direction. Tater tots deserve a specific moment, because their origin is so perfectly illustrative of the era's food philosophy. In 1953, The Ore-Ida Company, a frozen potato processor based in Ontario, Oregon, found itself with enormous quantities of potato scraps left over from their French fry production. These fragments were too small to be sold as fries, but too numerous to waste. Founders F. Neffy Grigg and Golden Grigg mixed the scraps with flour and seasoning, extruded them through a machine into small cylindrical shapes, and fried and froze them. The result was a product that used a waste byproduct, required no culinary skill to prepare, and was palatable to children, an entirely manufactured food object with no prior existence in any culinary tradition, created entirely to solve an industrial surplus problem that then became a staple of the American school lunch and a nostalgic touchstone for everyone who grew up eating it. You cannot make that story up, and you do not need to. The 1950s did not invent fast food, but they did perfect it and make it aspirational. McDonald's opened its first franchise locations in the mid-50s using the speedy service system, an assembly line approach to burger production that applied the logic of industrial manufacturing to the preparation of food. The result was a hamburger that cost 15 cents, tasted exactly the same every single time, and could be in a customer's hands within seconds of ordering. Drive-in restaurants spread across suburban America like a particularly cheerful virus, catering to the newly car-obsessed culture and turning the automobile into a dining room. Eating in your car was not a compromise. It was a lifestyle, a symbol of mobility, modernity, and the pleasurable freedom of not having to sit still. The McDonald brothers, Richard and Maurice, had been running a conventional drive-in restaurant in San Bernardino, California since 1940, doing reasonably well, but frustrated by the inefficiency of the standard drive-in model. Large menus, car hops, long waits, high turnover of staff, and inconsistent quality. In 1948, they shut down the restaurant, dismissed the car hops, reduced the menu to a handful of items: hamburgers, cheeseburgers, French fries, milkshakes, soft drinks, and redesigned the kitchen as a production line. Every station had a specific narrow function. Every worker performed the same actions in the same sequence every time. The grill was configured for maximum throughput. The fry station was standardized. The result was a kitchen that produced food faster and more consistently than any restaurant operation previously attempted, with lower labor costs and minimal training requirements for new staff. The efficiency was real and genuinely impressive as an engineering achievement, the same way a particularly well-designed factory is impressive as an engineering achievement. Ray Kroc, a milkshake machine salesman who became aware of the McDonald brothers' operation because they had ordered an unusual number of his machines, recognized what he was looking at and proposed a franchise arrangement. The brothers were cautious. Kroc was not. By the end of the decade, the McDonald's franchise operation was expanding at a rate that the brothers had not anticipated and were not entirely comfortable with. Kroc eventually bought them out entirely, and the rest is a history measured in billions of customers and billions of pounds of beef. The drive-in restaurant, which predated McDonald's speedy service system and coexisted with it throughout the decade, represented a different and in many ways more characteristically 50s vision of fast food. The drive-in was social in a way that McDonald's walk-up counter was not. You drove in, parked, and a car hop came to your window, often on roller skates, in a uniform, carrying a tray that attached to your car door. You ate in your car with other cars around you, full of other people eating in their cars, the radio playing through your dashboard, the evening warm enough to roll the windows down. It was dining as leisure, a social gathering, as performance of the specifically American pleasure of the automobile. The food at a drive-in was not dramatically better or worse than the food at McDonald's. Burgers, fries, malts, root beer floats, but the experience was entirely different. Where McDonald's had removed the social dimension in favour of pure efficiency, The drive-in had made the social dimension the product. You were not just buying a hamburger, you were buying an evening, a location, a community of other people doing the same thing at the same time. The drive-in eventually lost ground to the fast food franchise model, not because the experience was inferior, but because the franchise model was cheaper to operate, easier to replicate, and better positioned for the highway interchange geography of the expanding interstate system. Efficiency, as usual in the 1950s, won. The 1950s were a complicated decade for nutrition science. On one hand, researchers were making genuine progress, identifying vitamins and their deficiencies, beginning to understand the relationship between diet and chronic disease, developing the first real frameworks for thinking about what a healthy diet might look like. On the other hand, the food industry was paying close attention to this research and had developed a remarkably useful strategy for responding to it: enrichment. If the refining process stripped out nutrients, put some back in and print it on the label. If a study suggested a food might be unhealthy, fund a different study. The relationship between the emerging nutrition science establishment and the food corporations that fed America in the 1950s was complicated, financially entangled, and would take decades to fully untangle. Ancel Keys was the most important nutritionist of the 1950s, and his work illustrates both the promise and the difficulty of nutrition science in this era. His 7-countries study, which examined the relationship between dietary fat and cardiovascular disease across populations in Europe, Japan, and the United States, was landmark research that helped establish the field of nutritional epidemiology and drew serious attention to the connection between what people ate and how they died. Keys was rigorous by the standards of his time, and his central finding, that populations eating diets high in saturated fat had higher rates of heart disease, has held up in its broad outlines even as the details have been complicated by subsequent research. The problem was the translation. Between the careful, qualified claims of a research scientist and the breakfast table of an American consumer lay a distance occupied by food company marketing departments, newspaper science reporters working on deadline, government nutritionists developing public guidelines, and a general cultural appetite for clear, actionable dietary advice that scientific evidence was not always positioned to provide. The nuanced finding that saturated fat from certain sources, in certain contexts, appeared to be associated with certain cardiovascular outcomes in certain populations, became the simpler message: fat is bad. And that message, once loose in the culture, was extraordinarily useful to the food industry, because fat is expensive to include in food and cheap to remove, and because food with the fat removed tastes flat and unpleasant, which creates an opening for sugar, which is cheap, which improves palatability, which the consumer accepts because the label says low fat, and low fat has been told to them to mean healthy. The substitution of fat with sugar in processed food products, which began in earnest in the late 50s and accelerated through the 60s and 70s, was one of the most consequential nutritional shifts in American dietary history, and it was enabled almost entirely by a selective reading of nutrition science that the food industry encouraged, because it happened to serve their interests. None of this required conspiracy or deliberate deception in the dramatic sense. It required only that companies fund research that examined the questions most likely to produce useful answers, publicize findings that supported their products, and allow unfavorable findings to receive less attention. It required that marketing language use scientific terms selectively and ambitiously. It required most of all that the consumer trust the label, the advertisement, and the cheerful authority of Betty Crocker more than their own instincts about what food was supposed to look and taste like. In the 1950s, that trust was essentially total. It would take another generation before the question started arriving in volume, and by then, A very great deal of sugar had already been eaten. Not everyone celebrated the processed food revolution. Even in the 1950s, as the food companies were congratulating themselves and the television was humming with jingles, there were voices, mostly women, mostly in kitchens, who looked at the Jell-O mold and the canned soup casserole and thought, "This is not food." Adele Davis published nutrition books warning about the effects of processed ingredients on health. Julia Child, who would explode onto television in 1963, spent the decade training in France and developing a philosophy of cooking rooted in real ingredients and actual technique. A quiet, deliberate counterpoint to the instant and the artificial. These women were not anti-progress. They were pro-taste, pro-nutrition, and just slightly ahead of a conversation the rest of America wouldn't be ready to have for another generation. Adele Davis was the most prominent nutrition critic of the 1950s, and she's worth knowing about because her story is simultaneously inspiring and complicated in ways that are instructive. A biochemist by training, Davis published a series of popular nutrition books beginning in the 1940s, most famously Let's Cook It Right and Let's Eat Right to Keep Fit, that argued, with genuine scientific grounding and considerable passion, that the American diet had been degraded by processing, and that the consequences for public health were real and serious. She was right about the broad diagnosis in ways that subsequent decades would confirm. She was also, in some of her specific claims, wrong in ways that gave her critics useful ammunition, and the food industry was not slow to deploy that ammunition against her broader message. Davis advocated for whole foods, fresh ingredients, and minimal processing at a time when the prevailing cultural message was that processing was progress. She argued that vitamins were destroyed by cooking methods, that refined flour was nutritionally deficient in ways that enrichment didn't fully address, and that the American reliance on packaged food was producing a population that was overfed and undernourished simultaneously. Her readers were a devoted minority, health-conscious consumers, early adopters of what would later be called the natural foods movement, people who found the cheerful certainty of the food industry's advertising slightly suspicious. They were not the mainstream, but they were there, reading their Adele Davis paperbacks in suburban kitchens surrounded by Campbell's cans, maintaining a quiet dissent. Julia Child's role in this period is more subtle, because she was not yet publicly visible. She spent the 1950s in France with her husband Paul, studying at the Cordon Bleu, cooking, eating, and developing the philosophy and the manuscript that would become Mastering the Art of French Cooking, published in 1961. But the work she was doing in those years was, in retrospect, a direct and systematic counterargument to everything the American processed food industry stood for. She was learning that cooking was technique, that technique could be taught, that the quality of the result depended on the quality of the ingredient, and that a person who cooked with butter and cream and fresh herbs and properly sourced meat was not being irresponsible or old-fashioned, they were being correct. Child was not a polemicist. She did not write manifestos against canned soup or position herself as an opponent of convenience food. She simply cooked real food with visible joy and infectious confidence, and demonstrated through 30 years of television that the American home cook was capable of considerably more than opening a can and turning on an oven. The contrast with the Betty Crocker model, corporate, synthetic, efficiency-focused, could not have been more complete. Both women fed the nation. Only one of them used real butter. While American food companies were busy engineering shelf-stable approximations of meals the rest of the world was still, by and large, cooking. France was producing the cuisine that Julia Child was learning. Italy was making pasta from scratch and curing its own meats. Japan was fermenting, pickling, and perfecting rice in ways that had been refined over centuries. Mexico was building layers of flavor from chilies, herbs, and slow-cooked proteins. And America, in the 1950s, was largely ignoring all of it, partly out of post-war cultural confidence, partly out of the genuine novelty and convenience of the new food system, and partly because the advertising was very, very good. The richness of global food culture sat just outside the frame of the American kitchen in this decade, available but untapped, waiting for a later generation to discover it as though for the first time. The post-war cultural moment in America was not hospitable to culinary humility. The country had just won a world war, had emerged as the most powerful economy on earth, and was producing consumer goods, including food, at a scale and variety that no other country could match. The supermarket with its 1,000 products was evidence of American abundance. The television dinner was evidence of American innovation. The gleaming refrigerator was evidence of American prosperity. Against this backdrop, the suggestion that France or Italy or Japan might have something to teach America about food was, for most of the decade, a proposition that landed somewhere between irrelevant and vaguely unpatriotic. Immigration was the main vector through which international food culture entered American life during this period, as it had been throughout the country's history. Italian-American communities in New York, New Jersey and Chicago maintained cooking traditions, homemade pasta, slow-simmered tomato sauce, antipasto, braised meats that bore no resemblance to the canned and processed mainstream. Chinese-American communities operated restaurants that introduced a significant number of non-Chinese Americans to flavors and cooking techniques they had never encountered. Mexican-American communities in California, Texas, and the Southwest maintained a rich culinary tradition that was simultaneously omnipresent in its region and largely invisible to the national food conversation. But these influences were contained. Neighborhood phenomena, restaurant experiences, the food of communities that existed somewhat outside the mainstream cultural narrative that the food industry and the advertising world were constructing. The national food conversation in the 1950s was conducted in the language of packaged products, brand names, and the domestic science of the efficient modern kitchen. It had no particular interest in what your Italian grandmother made on Sundays, or what you could order at the Cantonese restaurant downtown, because those things did not come in boxes, could not be manufactured in factories, and were not available for mass distribution through the supermarket system. The irony is that many of the flavor compounds the food industry was spending enormous resources trying to synthesize in their laboratories the umami depth, the complexity of slow-cooked meat, the brightness of fresh herb, were available reliably and cheaply in the cooking traditions that were quietly being practiced in ethnic enclaves across the country. The food scientists were chasing with chemistry what the Italian grandmother had already solved with time and technique. The gap between those two approaches, industrial synthesis versus traditional practice, would eventually close, but only after the processed food era had run its full course and left a generation hungry, in every sense, for something more real. If you wanted to understand what the processed food boom meant at ground level, you looked at what American children were eating in the 1950s, because children were the most enthusiastically marketed demographic in the entire food industry ecosystem. A typical child's diet in this decade might include sugar cereal for breakfast, a sandwich on Wonder Bread with Velveeta for lunch, a snack of Twinkies or Oreos after school, and a dinner assembled primarily from cans, washed down at various points, with Kool-Aid, Tang, bottled soda, or chocolate milk made from a powder. The sugar load was extraordinary. The artificial ingredient count was impressive. Nobody called it junk food yet because the category hadn't been named. These were simply foods, modern foods, the foods of the future. The Twinkie arrived in 1930 but became a cultural fixture in the 1950s, and its story is worth telling as a representative case study in processed food engineering. The original Twinkie was a banana cream-filled sponge cake, produced by the Continental Baking Company, the same people who made Wonder Bread, as a way of using the banana cream-filling machines during the off-season when fresh strawberries, the usual filling, were unavailable. When World War II banana rationing made banana flavouring scarce, the filling was switched to vanilla cream, and it stayed vanilla after the war because by then consumers had accepted the vanilla version, and there was no strong commercial reason to go back. The shelf life of the Twinkie became its most famous characteristic, and the basis of an enduring American mythology, suggesting that the cakes would survive nuclear war, outlast civilization, and be found by future archaeologists as evidence of what the 20th century valued. The actual shelf life of a commercial Twinkie in the 1950s was approximately 25 days, impressive compared to a homemade cake, which would go stale in 2 or 3 days, but considerably more modest than the legend suggested. The extended shelf life was achieved through a combination of low moisture content, preservatives, and the replacement of the dairy cream filling with a vegetable, shortening base substitute that resisted spoilage better than real cream. The Twinkie, in other words, lasted longer than a homemade cake largely because it had progressively fewer ingredients in common with a homemade cake. Children ate the Twinkie and its packaged snack cake brethren, the Hostess cupcake, the Ding Dong, the Ho Ho, because they were sweet, consistent, cheap, available everywhere, and came in individual wrappers that fit in a lunchbox without refrigeration. Parents gave them to children because they were convenient. The children didn't complain, and the advertising said they were an appropriate part of a balanced diet, which was technically true in the same way that technically anything can be part of a balanced diet if you define the rest of the diet carefully enough. The packaged snack cake became a standard component of the American childhood food experience in the 1950s, with a speed that suggests it was meeting a genuine need, the need for something sweet, portable, and reliable, while simultaneously creating a taste preference for that precise combination of sweetness, softness, and artificial vanilla that would remain stubbornly embedded in the culture for decades. What the children of the 1950s were eating, taken together, was a diet that had been designed by food engineers, marketed by advertising professionals, distributed by corporations, and optimized for every consideration except long-term nutritional consequence. The children did not know this. They knew that the cereal had a prize in the box and the Twinkie was in their lunch, and the Kool-Aid was sweet and cold, and those things were good. They grew up, and their children ate similarly, and their children's children are still, to a meaningful degree, navigating the taste preferences and dietary habits that were installed in the American palate during this single extraordinary decade. The processed food boom of the 1950s did not produce immediate, visible catastrophe. People did not fall over in grocery store aisles. The food was, in the basic sense, safe, regulated, tested for acute toxicity, and free of the pathogens that had made food genuinely dangerous in previous centuries. What it produced instead was a slow, generational shift in the baseline of American health, rising rates of obesity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and diet-related chronic illness that would begin to emerge in the 1960s and 70s, and would become a full-blown public health crisis by the end of the century. The epidemiologists who eventually connected these outcomes to the diet were working backward through decades of Jell-O molds and TV dinners, trying to explain a set of numbers that, in hindsight, pointed fairly directly at the contents of the 1950s refrigerator. The relationship between the American diet and American health outcomes is one of the most studied and most contested areas in the history of medicine, and the caution required when making specific claims about it is significant. Nutrition epidemiology is a genuinely difficult science. It relies on people accurately reporting what they ate over long periods, controlling for an enormous number of confounding variables, and drawing conclusions from associations that are real but rarely simple. The story of dietary fat and heart disease, of sugar and metabolic syndrome, of ultra-processed food and obesity is not a clean story with a single villain and a clear mechanism. It is a complicated story involving multiple interacting factors across decades of individual behaviour and population-level change. With that caveat firmly in place, the numbers moved. American obesity rates, which had been relatively stable through the first half of the 20th century, began a sustained upward trend that correlated with the rise of processed food, the expansion of fast food, the proliferation of sugar-sweetened beverages, and the decline of home cooking from fresh ingredients. Type 2 diabetes, once relatively rare, became dramatically more common. Cardiovascular disease, already the leading cause of death in America, persisted at rates that prompted serious public health concern. The timing of these trends, their correlation with dietary changes, and the parallel research showing similar trajectories in other countries as they adopted Western-style processed food diets, pointed toward the food supply as a significant contributing factor, even when the precise mechanisms remained debated. The food industry's response to this emerging evidence followed a pattern that would become deeply familiar over the subsequent decades. Fund research that examined specific ingredients rather than dietary patterns. Emphasize the complexity of causation and the absence of definitive proof. Promote the concept of personal responsibility. It's not the food, it's the choices the consumer makes about how much to eat. Introduce modified versions of problematic products, reduced fat, reduced sugar, added fiber, that address the specific criticisms without fundamentally altering the manufacturing philosophy. Keep the advertising running. The response was not entirely cynical. Some of the research was genuinely useful, and the modified products sometimes represented real improvements. But the net effect was to delay the reckoning with the processed food model by several decades, during which several more generations of children grew up eating Twinkies and Tang and coming to regard them as normal. Stand in a modern American grocery store and try, really try, to find a product that has no connection to the processed food revolution of the 1950s. It is harder than it sounds. The flavouring compounds, the shelf life extension techniques, the factory farming infrastructure, the fast food supply chain, the advertising strategies, the concept of the brand as a food identity, all of it traces back in some direct or indirect way to decisions made in corporate boardrooms and industrial kitchens in that one decade. The children who grew up eating TV dinners became the adults who built the modern food industry. The taste preferences formed in those 1950s kitchens became the baseline that food scientists still design toward today. The boom was not just a moment, it was a foundation, poured in a decade, still load-bearing. The most direct legacy is infrastructural. The systems built in the 1950s to manufacture, distribute and retail processed food at national scale are the same systems, expanded and technologically updated, that operate today. The refrigerated trucking network, the cold storage warehouse grid, the supermarket supply chain, the franchise fast food model, the centralized food manufacturing facility producing identical product for distribution across the country. These are not new inventions, they are 1950s inventions that have been running continuously for 70 years, accreting scale and efficiency and market share with each passing decade, until they constitute an infrastructure so vast and so deeply embedded in the economy that dismantling or even significantly modifying any part of it represents an undertaking of extraordinary complexity. The taste legacy is less visible but equally durable. Flavor scientists who work for food companies today are designing products to meet taste expectations that were established in the 1950s and have been reinforced by every subsequent decade of processed food consumption. The precise sweetness level, the specific salt concentration, the textural qualities of a snack food that make it satisfying, these parameters are not arbitrary. They have been calibrated against the preferences of consumers who grew up eating foods calibrated against the preferences of consumers who grew up eating the original 1950s products. The baseline keeps moving, always toward more intense, more consistent, more engineered flavor, because the food that any generation grew up eating becomes the definition of normal for that generation, and normal is what food scientists are paid to deliver. The marketing legacy may be the most consequential of all. The principle established in the 1950s that food is not just fuel, but identity, that the brand is the feeling, and the food is the vehicle, that advertising can build emotional associations between a product and a consumer that persist from childhood into adulthood, has only been amplified and refined in the decades since. The techniques are more sophisticated now. Social media targeting, algorithmic advertising, influencer marketing, personalized promotions based on purchase history. But the underlying insight is unchanged from the day a food company first put a cartoon tiger on a cereal box and had him say the word "great" with conviction. Children form attachments. Attachments become habits. Habits become identity. Identity is extremely difficult to displace with nutritional information, regardless of how clearly it is presented. The 1950s figured this out first, and the food industry has been operating on that understanding ever since. Every action has a reaction, and the processed food boom of the 1950s eventually produced a reaction so large and so culturally significant that it reshaped American food culture all over again. The organic movement, the slow food movement, the farm-to-table philosophy, the celebrity chef, the farmer's market, the ingredient list scrutiny, the documentary about where food comes from. All of it is, in some sense, a response to the 1950s, a long, slow, still unfinished attempt to walk back from a set of decisions that were made very quickly, very confidently, and with very little attention paid to what might happen 50 years down the road. The processed food boom gave America convenience, abundance, and a set of taste preferences, baked deep into the culture. The reckoning with it has taken, and continues to take, the rest of the century. The counterculture movement of the 1960s was the first large-scale social rejection of the processed food model, and it arrived with the full commitment to inconvenience that characterizes genuine ideological conviction. Communes grew their own vegetables. Health food stores opened in cities and college towns, selling whole grains, dried legumes, and fresh produce to customers who had decided that the supermarket represented a conspiracy of some description. The Whole Earth catalogue promoted a philosophy of self-sufficiency that explicitly positioned homegrown food against corporate food. Francis Moore Lappé published Diet for a Small Planet in 1971, arguing that the industrial food system was environmentally unsustainable as well as nutritionally compromised. The food counterculture was ideologically serious, often practically uncomfortable, and occasionally insufferable about itself, but it was also right about most of the important things, and it planted seeds that would take another generation to fully germinate. The 1980s and 90s brought the natural food supermarket. Whole Foods opened its first store in Austin, Texas in 1980, which performed the neat trick of taking the health food store ethos and applying to it the supermarket's infrastructure, scale, and retail sophistication. You could now buy organic produce, artisanal cheese, and sustainably sourced fish in a building with a parking lot and a shopping cart, without the political commitment required by the commune approach. The natural food movement had found a business model, and the business model worked. Other retailers noticed. Conventional supermarkets added organic sections. The USDA established organic certification standards. A category that had been a fringe alternative was becoming a mainstream market segment. Julia Child's television career, which ran from 1963 to the mid-90s, constituted a 30-year demonstration that home cooking from real ingredients was pleasurable, achievable, and more satisfying than anything that came out of a box. She was not a polemicist, as noted earlier, but the cumulative effect of watching a woman cook real food with joy and skill for 3 decades was to keep alive, in the American cultural imagination, the possibility that cooking was worth doing. The celebrity chef culture that followed, from the Food Network era of the 90s onward, owed a direct debt to Child, and through her, to the French culinary tradition she had absorbed in the 1950s, precisely when the American food industry was moving in the opposite direction. The long walk back from the processed food boom is still underway, and it is proceeding with all the complications that attend any attempt to reverse a transformation that has been running for 70 years and has become deeply embedded in economics, infrastructure, culture, and individual habit. The farmer's market exists alongside the drive-through. The organic section exists alongside the processed food aisle in the same supermarket. People read ingredient lists with an attention their grandparents never brought to the exercise, and then buy the product anyway because it is convenient and the children prefer it. The 1950s are not over. They are simply coexisting, noisily and unresolved with everything that came after, which is, when you think about it, exactly what you would expect from a decade that put a whole chicken in a can and called it progress. And so, here we are. The end of a decade that changed what America ate, how it ate, and, quietly, permanently, what it believed food was supposed to be. You've travelled through the whole strange journey tonight. Through the ration tins and the railway cars of frozen turkey, through the jello moulds that nobody questioned and the casseroles that required exactly 1 can and 0 apologies. Through the television commercials that made opening a tin of soup feel like an act of love, and the cartoon tigers who told an entire generation of children what great tasted like. Through the gleaming white refrigerators and the supermarket aisles humming under fluorescent lights, and the school cafeteria trays with their tater tots, and their rectangular pizza, and their pale, unwavering commitment to beige. These were real people, living real lives, doing their best with the tools and the information and the cultural moment they had. The housewife who served Velveeta casserole on a Wednesday night was not failing her family. She was feeding them, efficiently, affordably, with the products that every advertisement and every magazine and every neighbour on the block had assured her were the right ones. She was doing what you do when you trust the world you live in to be telling you the truth about itself. And the scientists, and the marketing teams, and the corporate executives who built that world, most of them believed in it too. They believed they were feeding a nation, solving problems, offering freedom from labour, freedom from spoilage, freedom from the grinding kitchen work that had consumed previous generations of women without ceremony or recognition. They were not entirely wrong. The convenience was real. The abundance was real. The liberation from certain kinds of drudgery was real. History is rarely the story of bad people doing bad things. It is more often the story of well-intentioned people making choices whose full consequences wouldn't arrive for decades, by which time the momentum was too great and the infrastructure too vast to simply reverse. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, full of whatever you ate today, whether it came from a farmer's market or a drive-through, whether it was cooked from scratch or reheated from a box, maybe spare a quiet thought for the generation that ate from cans and fed the future anyway. For the housewives who stood in their modern kitchens and opened their condensed soups and did not know they were living through a revolution. For the food scientists in their white coats chasing flavour with chemistry. For the children who ate their sugar cereal on Saturday mornings and thought the cartoon tiger was telling them the truth. They were stubborn, they were optimistic, and they were genuinely trying. Just like every generation before them, in every era we've ever visited on this channel, whether they were huddled over a medieval hearth, or sailing through a Caribbean storm, or navigating the corridors of a Russian palace. People doing their imperfect best with what they had. History is full of jello molds. Some of them are suspended in lime gelatin with cream cheese and olives, and you cannot explain them, and you do not need to. You just need to rest. So close your eyes now. Let the fluorescent lights of the 1950s, supermarket fade, let the jingles quiet down, let the Twinkie shelf life mythology dissolve into the dark. You made it through, just like they did. Good night.